So welcome to the Digital Economist from the World Economic Forum here in Davos, Switzerland. We are holding our inaugural roundtable and very excited to have a huge turnover and a highly curated roundtable. The Digital Economist is an impact platform focused on thought leadership and bringing investable opportunities in alignment with the Sustainable Development Goals to the fore. So we're very excited to welcome folks on January 23rd this evening, and looking forward to great partnership and a lot of value we create for the community along the way. So welcome. Good afternoon. How are you?
Thank you. Good afternoon.
Hello and welcome, everyone. Fantastic. Felipe, where are you joining from?
I'm joining from San Jose, Costa Rica. Please forgive me for the technical difficulties that made me arrive a bit late. I'm ready to go and share good stuff.
Yeah, that's all of us. As we were talking last week, we were sharing stories of how the internet is breaking here and there and what have you, and how we take digital technologies for granted, right? We got a whole paper on it. So Felipe, I think we can dive right in. I know we're starting a few minutes late. We have attendees joining in already. So welcome everyone. This is our 23rd and perhaps what's going to be my favorite speaker series webinar so far. We've been doing this since a while, since October, every week. With a little break over the Christmas holidays, and we're almost close to the end of our season 2 with one more speaker, or 2 more speakers actually next week. So Felipe, welcome. I have a lot to say about the World Economic Forum, a lot of things to ask you and everything that you do. So thank you very much, and thank you for joining us today, and very excited to get started.
Thank you, Navroop. And I'm going to start in a very unique way. I like to say that the work that we do has always, has to have eyes on the horizon and feet on the ground. My name is Felipe Carazo. I work for the World Economic Forum under the Tropical Forest Alliance, which is an initiative that aims to really diminish the impact that commodity supply chains have on deforestation. So the reason why you see a map on the background and not the World Economic Forum logo is because I was late. And I was late because I work out of Costa Rica. I live in Costa Rica. And I started my job with the Tropical Forest Alliance just in the moment the pandemic came out. So I'm a very unique case within the forum because I work remote as a result of the new digital world. However, I'm connected through the virtual platform that the forum has. Honestly, I was not late. I was on time, but I couldn't log through the platform that the forum allows us to work with because it doesn't provide enough bandwidth for a Zoom presentation as the one you deserve. So I was struggling with this connection and was able to jump through my Gmail. So that's why you get the real world map on the back and not the World Economic Forum. However, I take this as a reminder that we have eyes on the horizon and feet on the ground. My grandfather always told me, no matter how you get into the technology, you always have to carry a pen with you and know how to use it. So the lesson is that we have to strive to do as much as we can with technology, but we have to be connected to the reality. So this brings me to my talk, about the reality. Well, we in the Tropical Forest Alliance, we are trying to set up a very unique mechanism that allows those stakeholders that are really committed to making a difference in the way we go about the production of supply chains to really impact the way this production goes about, so that we have a deforestation-free production of supply chains, of commodity in supply chains. Which are the main sub-commodities we work with? We work with soil, palm oil, beef, cocoa, and dairy. And those commodities have been associated to a high level, about 40 to 50% of the deforestation in tropical forests. So how do we tackle this as part of an effort to really turn it around and create a development agenda? This is not a conservation agenda. This is a development agenda. This is an agenda in which we want to really make sure that the polarization and tension that exists between North and South, between markets and producers, between public and private, between development and environment gets diminished and not polarized, right? The way we go about this is that we brokered a series of alliances from stakeholders from the public sector, from the private sector, and the civil society. Up to date, our membership, our network of partners goes beyond 150 members, and it goes all across the world, tackling into companies that work in the downstream of the supply chains, retailers, manufacturers, and also companies that are in the upstream of the supply chains, those producing and those trading the products, but also the civil society organizations that have pushed to really pressure countries, companies, scenarios where you had a enormous level of impact on the ground in terms of deforestation, and even public sector representatives would be agencies or even governments that are really willing to step up. So under that logic, housed under the World Economic Forum, the Tropical Forest Alliance aims to set a different tone on how we can go about this challenge. Before I go into details to try to explain how we can go about this by tapping into stakeholder capitalism, as it has been called, and how to link to finance and use technologies, let me come one step back and share a little bit about me. I joined the Tropical Forest Alliance as head of public sector engagement, with the intention of helping this value proposition get catalyzed and accelerated beyond the cornerstone that the mobilization of private sector has. So how can we develop an approach that follows a different route, right? I worked for years on developing public-private partnerships. I did that. I started working with the United Nations Development Program. Then I worked with the Nature Conservancy, and then with the Fundecor, an NGO in Costa Rica. So I've been exposed to how you engage with governments in different ways. And normally you have a dynamic that goes around, governments, and then the NGOs pushing the governments, and then, the private sector trying to cling to it to the extent needed. So we want to, what I like from the Tropical Forest Alliance is that we want to, in a way, push the private sector to take a leadership role and the way they can influence the public agenda. The effort requires a lot of creativity and innovation, because for you to have a private sector to go beyond their own spectrum of action, it requires a value proposition. I'm going to share you a couple of examples and build a story around this. Within the setting of a country like Indonesia, probably many of you are aware that the highest producer country of palm oil, it's Indonesia, and there's been a lot of impact in the forest, especially 20, 30 years ago, because of production increase on demand for palm oil. There's been a huge struggle to try to revert this, and over the last years there has been a lot of positive advances on changing this trend. There's evidence that the rate of deforestation has reduced significantly in a country like Indonesia. It hasn't, stopped, but it has reduced significantly, and that's a result of a series of efforts led by different stakeholders, would be civil society organizations, government, and private sector. But we like to think that the private sector stepped up to the challenge in such a way that it started to mainstream the good practices that made this occur. Now, it didn't came up just because of good faith. It came because there was a lot of pressure from the NGO sector. There was a series of measures that highlighted the problem, and that has led to a change in dynamic. We in the Tropical Forest Alliance are now conducting what we call a study about a decade of progress towards eliminating deforestation in Indonesia. And the effort aims to try to pin down what are the conditions, what are the measures that led to progress in a country like Indonesia, so that we can build trust between the stakeholders. Instead of falling into the trap, this is business related, this is government related. No, what are the impact measures? What's the state of affairs now? What's the level of deforestation? Where is it now? What's the community production impact to that deforestation as it is? What's the reduction in frequency and severity of peat and forest fires? How are jurisdictions engaged? What's the recognition of customary forest and community forest management? So that measure of impact sets you a baseline out of which you can start to tap or identify the stakeholder contributions, right, into developing an activity into sustainable sectorial economic activity. What's behind those impact measures leads you to, what are the enablers? How has the government of Indonesia enacted policies to advance sustainable development? What are the corporate action towards implementing what we refer to as no deforestation, no peat, and no exploitation standards? What is the level of trade that has surged? There's an enormous demand. Sometimes the message is stop planting palm oil, use other sources. What turns out that within the oil sources, vegetable oil sources, the palm, it's one of the sources that has a better yield per hectare with comparison to other sources. So it's not black and white, right? What's the level of civil society influence, not only in raising the flag when there's problems, but also in keeping up the push of good practices? And how can you go about engaging smallholders in the value chain so that there's important impact or important inclusivity to make sure that the economic benefit gets spread around. By tackling a complex problems in such a way that you look at the baseline, it's better. It makes it more easier in a way to create an constructive enabling environment to really create that stakeholder collaboration and therefore jump into a stakeholder capitalism model. Like how you can really make sure that this doesn't fall into a romantic dynamic, but rather a pragmatic dynamic. Of course, this means you have to really go out and assess which are the push forces and which are the pull forces, and how you create the appropriate brokeraging for this to happen, for these push forces and pull forces to get balanced out in such a way that sustainability gets achieved. Supportive policy environment, the responsibilities, shared responsibilities across the supply chain. How do we look into the market rewarding sustainability? All these elements can lead you to set a good dynamic out of a region, out of a country, out of the ground, out of a producing spectrum, so that the way the development model gets shaped up, it's more balanced, right? Of course, this leads you to identify those primary drivers of progress, the government action, the corporate action, and the civil society role in this, which is primarily, especially in our geography. But what are the secondary drivers? Where does banks and investors come in? Where does consumer country governments come in? You have the European Union now advancing a legislative proposal that aims to control deforestation in these regions. Well, how do you play out on that game so that you really create an enabling conditions? What are the conditions of the global commodity markets? Therefore, things are not isolated. You have to have feet on the ground, eyes on the horizon. But by working with those main stakeholders in building a good value proposition, you can start to influence or connect the dots with the global frameworks. This brings me to the finance component. Well, how do you create incentives for this stakeholder collaboration to go one step further? Within the Tropical Forest Alliance, we've started to push an effort that we refer to it as the IPDD, Investors Policy Dialogue on Deforestation. Basically, how can we really create a mechanism that engages? There's many different finance stakeholders, right? You have the banking sector, you have the asset owners, you have even the insurance community. Well, how do you get them to be part of that domino effect? Why? Because they also they manage risk, right? It's all about managing risk. This is about doing good business. And while you manage risk, you have to follow up the trends of consumption. And if we have an aware consumption level, then you can assess if your money, the way you're deploying your capital, it's at risk or not, because potentially some of the corporations and the companies that are involved in the production of, let's say, palm oil in this case, might be subject to volatility, being volatile. Point being, this IPDD, this Investors Policy Dialogue on Deforestation, it's a way of creating a second layer of reaching out to these factors of influence. Now, to be effective on that brings us to the equation of information management, right? If you really want to manage risk, you need to have a way of mapping that out. Investors need good information out of the ground. So how do you go about that in a way that you have a good set of information across the board that can lead you to assess risk and therefore adjust your investment policies to really incentivize those that are taking the leadership of good practices and those that aren't. So this brings us to the policy forefront. For example, now we are collaborating at a high level with the United Kingdom, who is stepping up as president of the Conference of the Parties of the UNFCCC, and they've developed a dialogue named Forest, Agricultural and Commodities Trade Dialogue, FACT Dialogue, which is starting to bring countries around this topic. You know, you have key producing countries such as Brazil and Indonesia and Argentina discussing these measures with the key consumer countries, not only the EU that's trying to raise the bar within the context of its own Green Deal, but the emerging markets such as China and India, because it's not good enough if you go full force in one market and then you have a leakage dynamic that's going to incentivize the mobilization of commodities without good practices in other markets. This is where the appropriate dialogue is required, but it's not enough just to have a dialogue. It's important that dialogue translates into good roadmaps of action and good commitments. So we in the Tropical Forest Alliance are trying to align the multi-stakeholder forces, you know, the bankers, the private sector, the civil society organizations, to really create collective action that can really accelerate the development of conditions to implement those commitments or to mobilize other commitments. You know, how do you create that domino effect? We need those champions. You know, we need the political champions. We need the Indonesians to feel that as a result of their stakeholder engagement on the ground, they can step up and say, you know, this is the reality and this is the challenge. You know, we have economic gap now as a result of the pandemic. We have to advance the empowerment of our communities on their landscape approaches, but we have to do it in such a way that we really mainstream deforestation-free action. And a country leadership or a fair negotiation where you have that gap, that south-north gap getting reduced, allows you to have a better setting to plug that multi-stakeholder force. Now, an issue such as finance risk linked to supply chains, you know, if we can take advantage of this dialogue and lead countries to commit to developing, you know, land tenure mechanisms that can be connected to, you know, uniform information data sets that can then be available for financial instruments, that provides a game changer, right? So which are those ideas, those transformative approaches that you could develop so that commitments can be tangible, can be connected to good building blocks that make a difference, that can allow you to mobilize the multi-stakeholder behind. And the mesh that can make that happen, it's technology. So here we're describing all the ingredients of what could be a digital economy solution, right? And I'm using this as an example. There's many variables. You go across the different supply chains. You can make the connections to other, you know, ecosystem services markets, such as the carbon piece. But the way we can be efficient is not only by assuring we mobilize stakeholders under this, you know, bottom-up approach of discussion, of effective interconnection, but in a way that we can also mainstream technology as a tool to accelerate the change. As the Digital Economist goes about, right? It's the technology as a tool to make human change in a positive way. Navroop, I will stop here and open for questions and in interaction, but hopefully this showcases an interesting approach within the, you know, sustainability forefront of how the digital economy can be applied.
Fantastic. All right, so I think you've talked about, basically you've checked all the boxes. I think so, you know, whether it comes to technology or stakeholder management, or how, you know, we are driving a lot of these initiatives, you're driving these initiatives, and how the forum is driving these initiatives. We have a number of people in the audience that are close to the forum who are joining us today, and I see Rinder and Mihaela and others. And I think I'd love to kind of learn a little bit more to what you previously talked about, on how do we, stay and know where we are and yet sort of keep our eyes on the horizon. I want to dig a little bit deeper into that. So WEF is now 51 years old, right? And moving forward, what initially started as, so this is probably a little bit historic, but what initially started as a forum of convening economists and policymakers suddenly become so much more than that, housing a number of initiatives like the one that you're driving and leading, and the intersectionality with the public sector or the private sector. But sort of moving forward, do you see new models of engagement emerging? And I'm asking this in service of the fact that, don't we need a little bit more like faster and radical collaboration to make those things happen sooner? Because from a planetary ecosystem perspective, and with the pandemic and the internet issues we are facing, it's quite clear that the time's ticking. So what would your take be on that? Curious to learn about what you see as sort of the next decade, and the models that are emerging there.
Yes, that's a great question. The forum has been speaking about the Great Reset. How do we take advantage of the change we've all gone through on the last year, right? As a result of the pandemic. I think the forum has really showcased the value of convening. That's been the biggest asset so far. How can you really use convening to try to accelerate change? And this has positioned the forum at the center of enabling effective public-private engagement, and that has to continue. But I think that we, as a result of this new challenge to have a great reset, we have identified a need of building from the convening to the impact. Right? How can we use the forces that we can activate to create impact? I would love to think that the Tropical Forest Alliance becomes serves as a proof of concept within the forum's wider spectrum of action to demonstrate how impact can take place, right? Without making it heavy, right? We the Tropical Forest Alliance, the secretariat is just 25 people, but the Alliance is 150 organizations and companies all across the board. We work out of the regions. We have strong presence in South America, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, and in China, plus in Europe, that allows us to really bridge through our members, through our partners, this discussion along this specific challenge, which is deforestation related to soft commodity supply chains. Now, if we're effective in the way we set up the convenings, that link that directly to impact and can start to mainstream technology so that we can really measure that and accelerate that and create empowerment of those stakeholders in such a way that there's a benefit, there's an incentive, there's a flow of finance in the right direction, we will be activating that dynamic of change and therefore reaching out a level of impact that's required. Hopefully, this can also be developed in the health industry, in the innovate, even the technology industry. There's so many spaces that can be benefited out of agile convenings that lead to good, tangible impact propositions. Now, the rate and the speed of how you can achieve that would depend on how we as a society can really master and steer the development of technology appropriately. This is what I like from the Digital Economist, that brings this challenge to all of us of how to really go in that direction.
That's very well said, Felipe. Thank you for sharing that. And I think you really touched upon, again, the power of tech, because by 2050, we'll have 8 billion people on the planet. And there is no other way but to use tech, right, if we want to scale impact. And a lot of the new models, I know a lot of the work that you're doing in sort of emerging finance and how we use tech to finally and ultimately help the physical world. I think that's perhaps the most interesting and inspiring part of this alliance in particular, right? Where we see digital technologies are racing forward, right? But we don't see that impact. And I think that relates to the question that Arvinder just asked, that the efficiency gains that are possible due to tech, particularly in urban environments, they don't necessarily translate to human well-being. And as you know, obviously, with the mission of the Digital Economist as well, I'll just love to learn. You're the perfect person to ask when we're talking about saving and regenerating forests. I mean, I learned about regenerative agriculture, Felipe. I think I shared that story with you. In Costa Rica, it changed my life. And I thought, damn, they're talking about all this sustainability, but we need to actively regenerate our resources if we are to stand a chance. It's beyond the point of just sustaining it. So I'd love for you to kind of touch upon a little bit on, I guess, the economic efficiency part of it and the trade-off with, with what it does to the physical environment that we live in, or environments that we live in, and what that means, right? And how do you, take that efficiency and translate that into something that useful for us and is a step forward towards human outcomes.
Yes, that's very interesting, and maybe and I think Costa Rica is an interesting example of how that goes, and I would highlight two concepts. One, the perfect is the enemy of the possible, right? If a country like Costa Rica, and speaking from my Costa Rican experience, Costa Rica in a way tested out many models and got the ball rolling with the system of environmental services, retribution of environmental services. If we would have gone through the, tried to be perfect on the model, we would still be debating about it 20, 30 years ago. It doesn't mean that you have to do things, loosely. No, you have to have things grounded, hopefully in science and information. But it was about being bold and taking risk and understand that models, the more you put variables in a model, the more you increase uncertainty. So, it's a game, right? You can strive to have the best model, but maybe at the end of the day, it's gonna be less cost effective. So taking risks and trying to set up models that are pragmatic, it's important. And you can calibrate on the way, but you can really create what's really relevant because we're humans. You create trends and by creating trends, you impact perceptions, and by impacting perceptions, you change behavior. So a country like Costa Rica, which many challenges to address, because we're very good on the green agenda. There's a lot to address on the brown and gray agenda, but we have changed the behavior, and we have changed the way we as a country see these kind of themes in such a way that it has become a trademark and a value proposition for even economic development all across the board. So that. That's part of the effect that I was referring to. The other thing that's important, you have to be bold. You have to be, try to be very succinct, try to, this is what I want to achieve. Of course, there's always added value and interconnections, and you should not ignore that, but you should try to, as we say, keep the eyes on the ball, right? You have to really go for something and try to look at it. And that's what I like from the Tropical Forest Alliance. Like, we're not trying to solve all the forest problems. We're trying to solve one fraction of it. But if we get that right, we can create a domino effect for the additional issues that are related to forestry, right? If we can get soft commodity supply chains to really embrace good practices, maybe we're going to have the champions in a region like Africa, the impact on the Congo Basin, activated. But the impact on the Congo Basin is not limited to corporate, linkages through supply chains. So, but by doing it well, I think we can activate a new dynamic, a new trend that can really foster conditions for that to happen. So I think what we need, it's more of a generation in different areas and different sectors of our economy that really galvanize these ideas and allow to create this collective action where there's no fear in testing out, in boldly testing out propositions and models. And if you have to adjust halfway through, you adjust, but action has to happen. That's how you can really start to steer the ship in the direction that we want. This is the radical collaboration you're speaking about.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly, Felipe, there. So, when it comes to action, do you see with your current work, do you see any resistance from governments and corporations that are usually quite slow to adopt change, or in fact, even adopt an experimental approach? In tech and in the entrepreneurial ecosystems, we talk about, rapid experimentation, rapid prototyping, and testing the idea out in the market. But policy doesn't have that luxury, right? So how do you sort of take that and convince those stakeholders? I mean, you gave an awesome overview, I think, of how we can make that happen. But what is it that you observe when the rubber hits the road?
Yeah, that's a good question, because there's no black and whites, right? You have a lot of gray tones, and you have to be sharp on the battles that you choose, right? And for example, in our case, we're more focused on working with the leaders than trying to pull the levers. How can we really consolidate those that really want to take action? And I'm going to give you an example. Within the Consumers Good Forum, which is an alliance of main retailers, companies in the world, there's a coalition that works with, of course, positive action, and we work with those companies, hopefully trying to activate leadership, right? And and that's in the downstream of the supply chains. And in a country like Indonesia, now, despite there's progress, as I shared on my earlier talk, that Indonesia is advancing now a job creation law. It's called the Omnibus Bill. It's very big, and it's a response to the pandemic, and it's trying to do certain changes. Indonesia went through a decentralization of government, and now it's trying to centralize again and create incentives to activate labor force because we're all suffering the impact of the pandemic. And it's, in a way, this creates a challenge, because if it's not well addressed, you could really have a gap that can reactivate the rates of deforestation. And this interesting thing is that, but at the same time, Indonesia is stepping up in this dialogue with the UK as co-chair of the dialogue. So there's political leadership. The idea is not to go back. The idea is to try to adjust and balance out, right? And this is very important. But this is where corporate engagement becomes relevant, because you have the CGF companies under this forest positive action, right, raising the hand and proactively trying to understand what's the impact of this omnibus bill on the deforestation-free practices. So this demonstrates that there's leaders, there's companies that are not thinking, okay, now they're lowering the bar, good for us. No, they're like, we want to know what's the impact so that the bar doesn't get lowered, because we're investing in trying to do things good, and that's what we want others to do. So we try to broker that dynamic and create that positive synergy between corporations and government so that we keep the bar high. And both the government in its own challenge of creating jobs and the companies in its own challenge of creating added value are helping each other stay in check at the level that's required. this is complex. This is not easy, but this is what we have to focus. Now, our energy is then let's try to work with those that want to lead, and hopefully by setting the bar high or keeping the bar high, you can pull the others. If you go and try to chase all the ones that are behind, it might take you, you know, it would be a radical frustration.
It would be a while. Yeah. No, that's I think I resonate with that, Felipe, because I started my career at the UN Environment Program in Geneva, working the trade unit, and I think that was very much the I guess the approach what you just talked about, which is work with the leaders, set the bar high, and use that as an example, leverage that to show the other parties here's how to do it, right, at international forums. So I guess from what I'm hearing is that approach continues to be the dominant approach, if you may, in making change happen at the global level. I'm curious to hear, what would be one of your favorite stories when it comes to change that, I guess you can share with us today that you think is a great example of how to move the needle forward? You talked about a number of examples, Felipe, that you gave us today, but I think what's your personal favorite? I'm curious to hear.
And I need to process that question. So the favorite take or the favorite approach?
Your favorite story of change. I think I was, this could be a personal story too. Costa Rica is a land of transformation where you're from and where you are currently. And this is, it just struck me that is a question I should ask over and beyond, the larger global change agenda. So what is it that inspires you? Maybe that's another way to ask
I'll share a small story as a example of what I really believe in. Okay, when I started working in conservation strategies, I worked at Costa Rica with the Nature Conservancy on an integrated and conservation development project, looking in an area that has protected, national parks, protected areas, but that there's a buffer area with communities, and we were trying to see how we could create a collaborative mechanism in which communities and, government institutions, park rangers would really find value in working together in managing a region. That's what we call an integrated conservation and development program, because there used to be a lot of strife, right? And communities are very complex. You have indigenous communities, you have campesino communities. So it was about creating this collaborative action. And this strategy led to a lot of empowerment from people. And there's a person called Ronald Romero. Ronald is just a local leader. And I met Ronald in the area, and he was, he didn't have much options. He either, he lived in a community next to this protected area, there's mountains, and on the Piedmont, what you find is pineapple, very intensive pineapple, a commodity, right? So he knew that his options were to work on the pineapple activity, which has a lot of fluctuation, or to migrate to the United States and work there and try to send resources to their family. And he didn't finish high school, right? But you could tell he had enormous ability of leadership, but he was not even aware about that. So by working with people, by connecting to people's self-empowerment and self-belief that they can really collaborate in making a change, no matter how complex the equation. In this specific case, we were able to work with Roger and get him motivated to such an extent that he ended up becoming a local leader that connected many of the communities that were in the different area. And this is a big area. Some of these communities would not even collaborate. Even in the Atlantic side, this was on the Pacific side. And the communities grouped themselves as a network called Kerkus, and the network was able to work an agreement with the park rangers. So the park rangers, the government, that used to see these communities as scattered communities that, how do you deal with this? Suddenly they found a counterpart with whom they developed what we call a shared responsibilities approach. So there was a win-win situation. And as a result of that, ecotourism and organic production, other things started to foster to provide alternatives for the development of the area. Even honey production out of nowhere, but linked to the value of having a protected area next to it. Many things occurred. Well, it turns out that years later, Ronald ended up representing civil society organizations in a biodiversity convention of the parties as part of the Costa Rican delegation. So to see one person that was on the brink of going illegally to the United States as a migrant to suddenly develop as a professional that's a fantastic story. What I want to get to is that one of the questions you make to me is what I do believe it's in human capacity and human will. So would it be a CEO on the highest of companies, right? Would it be a government representative that's, leading the voice of Argentina on a fact dialogue? Would it be a civil society leader in a place like Kalimantan? How do we tap into human, conditions to really get the most out of us and create that collective action? So Ronald's story, it's an indicator that deep inside we all have a side that if it's effectively aligned and motivated, can really create that collective union that helps us achieve a paradigm shift.
That's beautiful, Felipe. Thank you so much for sharing that. And it's so interesting you said that because, when we launched the Digital Economist at Davos, right, last year in January, the thing that was really inside my mind and my heart and what we talked to our council about, partners about, and everybody we convened there was the hero's journey, right, by Joseph Campbell, which I'm sure you know about, which is, perhaps the most famous form of, story or, a typical human story, right, where you go from through challenges and you emerge with the gift, and then it becomes a matter of giving that gift away to the world, right? And you go on many heroes' journeys simultaneously, and the process continues to happen. So I think the story that you shared very much is that shared experience, perhaps, of human life. And I really love the focus on the individual. And I think, so the World Economic Forum has a program, right? The Young Global Scholars, Global Leaders by GL, which is very much, in the spirit of the individual transformation, people who would, I guess, the invest mind or take would go on to impact the world. So my understanding is that's very much at the core of the forum's philosophy too. Would you agree with that? Is that fair to say?
Yes, I agree with that. I think there's an intention to really tap into human capital. I think that's a well-needed message, especially coming from a space like the forum that has the ability of, engaging high-level, power structures. If we really are aware as we move forward and addressing complex topics and issues, that the human dimension should not be lost, this leads us to balancing the act. This is the feet on the ground, right? Yes, we have to have eyes on the horizon. Yes, problems are complex. Yes, problems have to be addressed at the highest of levels. But we need the Ronalds, right? We need the Ronalds on the ground. We need that to happen. And that's why I like to always remember that story, because it also has to keep people like you and me who are trying to address the things connected to the ground. And that's why I should be comfortable That even if
Right.
I made it 3 minutes late to this meeting, it doesn't matter because we have the capacity as people to just steer things correctly, right?
Right.
That's why I have that map instead of this, right? Both
I love
things,
it.
both things count. Both things are important
Right.
because we have to have the capacity to engage at a level of the fact dialogue, but we need to engage with the Ronalds of this world because both things are needed, and the human dimension is important. I believe that the forum it's committed to that, to engaging and empowering that concept across the board. And I believe that the further we can demonstrate that impact can occur through collective action, the better we can reinforce that concept. And this, again, brings me to the digital economist role. We do need the tools because the level of change has to occur quickly. We need those Ronalds to be connected with the Ronalds from Southeast Asia and create a collective force that is a positive force that allows us to really send the message to the structures that change has to go in the direction that we want. It's what the digital economist speaks. How do we use technology to steer development in a way that includes the human component to a fair and more just and more balanced society?
Right, right. I agree wholeheartedly, Felipe. I think you've said it better than I ever have, and so we'll hold on to that. That insight and sort of I think the gems you've brought forth today. So we have just a few minutes left in the conversation, just 3 minutes or so. What would be your parting message? And of course, the conversation continues, but for today's webinar, to our audience and also our podcast listeners, what would be your key message for the decade ahead past the pandemic?
That's a good question. I think that my message is this is an opportunity, okay, and it's an opportunity. The same elements that accelerated the pandemic should be seen as the assets we have to reset the scheme moving forward. The pandemic went quickly out of hand because we suddenly have a globalized community, right? This is not the first pandemic that humanity has to deal with. No, we've dealt with many. Probably the first that this generation, now standing on planet Earth, has to. And of course, it happened when we have a globalized world. So it was really hard to deal with. At the same time, we have an interconnected world. We can really create that positive energy. And I would like to think that, yes, we have to continue on, upscaling and mainstreaming good practices, upscaling and mainstreaming good policies, working with governments. Those schemes of governance have to continue to be pushed out. But there's a content back channel that's required. That content back channel sets the bedrock out of which you can impose the change in the structural level. That content back channel is built up by the Ronalds, by the NGOs in Southeast Asia, but the middle staff politicians in Argentina, and we need to use technology to create that mesh, that interconnectivity of that content back channel, so that it provides the inputs and the elements that will actually steer and catalyze the way we mainstream policies in our modus operandi. So that will be my message, because everyone that's here can be part of that content back channel. We can build those synergies. We can build those connections. Would you be in Hawaii or in Costa Rica? Things can happen, and we have therefore an opportunity with a set of tools and a set of dynamics and connectivity across the world that allows us to achieve this. And if the Zoom connection doesn't work for 5 minutes, it's okay. You have to continue until you get it right.
Right.
Make it work.
Exactly. That's exactly right. So don't stress out about little things in life. I think that's what I'm hearing here. And, focus on what matters and focus on the big thing. Focus, look beyond the horizon. Always so inspiring talking to Felipe. Thank you so much for taking the time today. Weaving stories. Yes, that one too. I'm sure we'll have a story to share.
We have the world in our hands. It's up to us to shape it up.
Love it. All right. That's a quote right there. Beautiful. Thank you so much again. Once again, thanks everyone for joining us today. And we had the absolute pleasure of hosting Felipe Carazo from the World Economic Forum, and leading the Tropical Forest Alliances. And my name is Navroop Sahdev, and we will see you next week. Thank you so much.
Thank you to everyone. Thank you, Navroop. Thank you to the Digital Economist.
Thank you. Ciao.